Hello guys, who would have guessed that there would be more people playing Battlefield 5 on Steam than 2042 this year? Definitely not on my bingo card, but in this video I wanted to cover what BF5 did right and also why people considered this a bad game. And I have some interesting comparisons to 2042 that might surprise you. So let's get into it. Battlefield 5 was announced as a World War II game in May 2018, which made sense after the success of Battlefield 1 and a natural progression in history. This is also the first time it was going to include a Battle Royale and free content for all without paid expansions. Then came the trailers. Now, completely opposite to what happened with Battlefield 1 and 2042, the trailers for BF5 were considered some of the worst of the series. No epic music, small-scale showcase of the concept and gameplay, in a singular area, also showing signs of unusual customization within its characters without historical accuracy. A complete 180 to what we saw in the Battlefield 1 trailer. The mismatch in costumes or uniforms make it only slightly obvious of the theatre of war in play. This was the start of the inconsistencies regarding the authenticity of the era. It seemed that DICE wanted to tell a different story of World War II that hadn't been seen before. As soon as we played the alpha, which was on the map Narvik, we got to play all the classes on Conquest and Breakthrough. Now Narvik wasn't the strongest choice in my opinion, but it satisfied vehicle and infantry gameplay enough to give people a taste. Unfortunately, it did highlight the issue that the all-white UI would blend in with the snow in most cases, but that would be somewhat fixed later. The UI of BF5 and 2042 has always been a hot topic, and always questions why you wouldn't just use references from older games. The alpha suggested it was going to be more of a hardcore Battlefield squad-based experience, with players truly relying only on teamwork in order to survive thanks to the new attrition mechanics. There was less ammo on spawn and no healing apart from partial health regen. Players of the series were immediately vocal about this change, including me, as it punishes any kind of solo gameplay. Initially, there was actually going to be no bandage mechanic for healing on the move, and there was no ammo and health containers around the map. Imagine if that had happened. Something we have learned is that you can't force random players to use teamwork. It needs to be convenient and intuitive. Playing solo on BF5 is harder than others in the series. The gunplay was improved from Battlefield 1 but not perfected. The game still had random recoil and spread was still an issue. But at least guns could be used at medium range and sometimes long range, unlike BF1. Now, performance-wise, you might be surprised to learn that the game during alpha actually ran similarly to how 2042 was released today. After browsing other several content creators' videos, you can see that most players are hovering around 90 to 100 FPS on the alpha, including myself on what I assume are somewhat decent PCs. The difference is that at that time, most people had lower expectations for how a modern FPS would run. 60 FPS was still mostly the norm, and there wasn't much to compare it to. And to be fair, on launch, some of these FPS issues were fixed. Now, the visual fidelity was actually improved over BF1, with more realistic lighting, environment detail, and even RTX implemented, but most people argued that BF1 looked better, especially in regard to player visibility. Likely an issue with over-detailed environments and the removal of 3D spotting, seeing players became more difficult than ever in this game. This was less apparent in the alpha map Narvik, but more obvious in the beta where we finally got to play the urban map Rotterdam. The outfits of certain classes in the beta became very difficult to see at longer ranges, and also when hiding in certain spots due to the harsh lighting and shadows in certain areas. With the faster TTK, slow recovery mechanics, and harsher visuals, it became more popular to play defensively. Players were rewarded more for positioning, being hard to see, and not moving around. This made the game slow down significantly compared to previous titles, at least at first. Rotterdam, however, was a fantastic map for the beta. I played more than 50 hours before launch, and guess what? It's the classic Battlefield map formula with dedicated infantry and vehicle areas which intersect but can avoid each other. This ended up being my favourite map in the game. Now, when the game was released, we got to play the full range of maps and experiences on offer, but the game was actually delayed for an entire month, just like 2042, from the 12th of October to the 9th of November in order to improve stability. On release, there was a few bugs and performance issues, especially some strange stutters for many players on PC. However, something that's still in the game to this day is the broken assignments, where if you complete an assignment, it will stutter your game extensively every time. As for the guns, there was a decent amount released at launch with 30 primary weapons, an increase over BF1's 24 primaries, however only 7 secondaries versus BF1's 19. And they added a new skill tree that unlocked as you used the weapon to mix things up. Instead of adding attachments, you simply picked the attributes you wanted without changing the look of the weapon. These, however, barely changed the outcome of the weapon in reality, and again it was kind of just straight upgrades with no downsides. On release, there were some very powerful weapons like the KE7 that dominated most matches, and for some reason all the SMGs were incredibly weak, making the medic class pretty unpopular at launch. They also added a very long animation to reviving, so reviving teammates became very much a risky chore that people didn't want to do in such a defensive game. They were supposed to add a dragging mechanic to allow you to pull players out of gunfire to safely revive them, but this was scrapped several weeks after release. Team play had a very small role in the gameplay of BF5 due to it being less convenient than previous games. Now, something that 2042 actually did right was the anti-cheat, whereas in Battlefield 5, we're not sure if one even existed. It was only a month or so into BF5 that cheaters started showing up regularly in matches. Now, regular players could avoid them if you kept switching servers, but for live streaming it became almost impossible. It was around December that streaming Battlefield became a nightmare, as cheaters would follow streamers from server to server and were only getting manually banned after reports of several days. This would be the start of the cheating epidemic, and it would only seem to get worse from that point forward, with no word from DICE about any improvements on the situation. Now, around the same time, there was a very sudden change to the TTK of most weapons before Christmas. This update meant that most weapons needed 1 or 2 additional bullets at close range and potentially 4 to 5 bullets at longer ranges to down a player. This was badly received and seemingly badly implemented, as it made some guns so bad that you could only kill 1 enemy per magazine, aka the FG42. It ended up being reverted quickly a week or so later, but it did show the start of some strange behaviour from DICE, and this would not be the last time. After this, we then waited for new content. We got given the Panzerstorm map around December, which was a very vehicle-heavy map, and then nothing happened for about 3 months. Things got a little stale, but then March rolled around. Battlefield Firestorm, the first ever Battlefield Royale. Converse to the reveal showcase, this trailer was spectacular, with good music choice, incredible visuals, and some light-hearted humour, with a little bit more focus on the World War II theme. The trailer was well received and people were excited to play the full Battle Royale, and later that month we finally got to play it. First impressions were good. This was also the birth of the plate system, which is what Warzone adopted, and also at that time the largest map in a Battlefield game ever. However, over time we would learn that bigger doesn't necessarily mean better. This Battle Royale still only allowed for 64 players on a map 10 times the size of Hamada. The early and mid game was very slow, and you were lucky if you found someone in the first 10 minutes of running around. There was also vehicles and tanks allowed in the map, which was a very confusing balance decision, bearing in mind it was almost impossible for a single player to take on a tank. And the worst part about the game by far was the loot system, where enemies would explode into items on the floor, which would either bunch up together, making it impossible to grab individual items, or the loot would fall through the map. But honestly, overall, the biggest issue with this game mode was the cadence. Extremely slow start, with barely any action for the first 10 minutes. Sure, there were some hot drops, but if you were downed and finished, that's it. No respawns. You had to watch your friends run around for another 20 minutes until the next match. And if you didn't find a vehicle, good luck running in vast open maps with little cover. I wonder where we saw that again. Regardless, after a month or so, the game was struggling to keep players engaged, and many people found long matchmaking queues. I think personally that Firestorm didn't do enough to innovate outside of a generic Battle Royale. It literally felt like they just saw PUBG, added it to Battlefield, added vehicles, job done. And also, very unfortunate timing that Apex Legends, the most watched Battle Royale to this day, came out just a month before and for free. But I will reiterate that even if Battlefield Firestorm was released free to play, I just feel like it isn't interesting enough to keep players engaged. After Firestorm's rise and fall, we then got pockets of content in the way of maps like Mercury, Marita, Provence, and eventually Metro. For me, these maps were actually a welcome surprise, and they're some of my favourite maps in the game. a great mix of infantry-only experiences alongside mixed vehicle maps that assisted mostly infantry gameplay. With the release of Firestorm in March and then these maps released bi-monthly, it was enough to keep me invested in BF5 long term. And then suddenly, Chapter 6 arrived. The launch of Battlefield 5 in the Pacific began. The Pacific trailer was an absolute masterpiece. Epic music, showcasing authentic uniformed soldiers from US and Japan, with battlefield moments and a more serious, gritty, warlike tone, including the world-famous battle Iwo Jima. This trailer felt like the Battlefield 5 that we wanted since day one. This is the first time it actually felt like a real World War II game. The content was released and we all got to play it, and it was great as a Battlefield fan. The maps were a little open, but there was just enough cover around. There was a decent mix of infantry and vehicle gameplay, although some of the vehicles introduced were a little bit powerful. Either way, the Battlefield community was overjoyed. However, just after the release of the Pacific update, DICE decided to mess with the weapon balance again. Just like the unusual update that happened weeks after initial release, again it meant some weapons became obsolete suddenly. DICE did eventually fine-tune these changes and improve the game in some areas, but it may not have been the best decision in the first place just after new players had gotten used to their favourite weapons. Either way, the Pacific was a net positive addition to BF5 overall, and I think a lot of us were expecting more of these authentic war experiences in the future, like D-Day, Stalingrad, and Berlin. A few months pass and we got 2 more Pacific maps, including the legendary Wake Island from previous Battlefields, and a mainly infantry-focused experience in the Solomon Islands. It's spring in 2020, Battlefield fans are eagerly awaiting the next big update in the live service. We finally get an announcement for the summer update, and it provides details for 2 maps to be released in the middle of 2020. However, when questioned further, the devs reveal that this will be the final major update for Battlefield 5. Just when we thought that BF5 was maybe picking up some steam, it seems that it just wasn't enough to keep it going. Devs would finish this update and then they would be moving on to develop the next Battlefield, which would be 2042. Ultimately, from a business perspective, the game had run its course and it probably wasn't viable to continue. The good news was at least the live service was free to all players, meaning everyone got to play all the new content without spending extra, unlike every previous Battlefield. However, this has now set a precedent that the game is not guaranteed consistent updates, as we're now seeing in 2042. Sure, new content is free, but who knows when you'll actually get it. For me, I spent about the same amount of time playing Battlefield 5 as I did BF1. I enjoyed the gameplay more in the end, but it didn't hit the mark in regards to atmosphere. The gunplay and movement was an improvement, and sniping in particular was very satisfying. I've said before that BF5 snipers are the best implementation in a Battlefield yet. This felt like a game where DICE wasn't really sure of their direction. Was it hardcore or casual? Was it authentic or an alternate reality? In the end, it became a Frankenstein of everything to try and appease players in every avenue. I believe the game would have been better received if they focused on a more authentic, traditional World War II game that covered more of the better known battles of the era, like we saw with the Pacific. What did you enjoy about Battlefield 5? What did BF5 do right or wrong? And how does it compare to 2042? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane, and if you did, leave a like and consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.